If you've been listening to this podcast for the last week, then you know that we've been telling anyone who will listen how amazing the film Sinners is. And that's for a lot of reasons, but among them is how the film talks about slavery. And it seems like that continues to be an important point of dialogue in our current day. So we wondered here on the podcast, what have historians had to say about slavery over time? And in fact, that's the subject of today's conversation. We invited on Dr. Scott Spillman. He just wrote a terrific book called Making Sense of Slavery, America's Long Reckoning from the Founding Era to Today. And essentially our conversation today is what is the history of slavery? In other words, what have scholars had to say about slavery over time? How have those views changed? Have there been historians who have actively participated in slavery? There are so many things that we can talk about because this is super important all the way up till today, where we continue to debate the legacy of slavery, its memory, and what this means to us all the way up till today. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. It was a really engaging conversation that I had with Scott, and I think you'll take a lot away from it. So sit back and relax, because Reckoning with Jason Herbert starts right now. We were just talking about this before I hit the record button, right? Here was one of the reasons why I was very excited to talk to you tonight. You're actually in Colorado. I have become convinced, Scott, that I was the only person in Colorado. Like, moving here from Eastern Time, nobody's on Mountain. There's like 75 people. Time. It's so weird, man.
I think it's the best time now that I've been here for a while.
Listen, anytime I'm on, it's like what everybody else needs to accommodate. However, I found that is not really the widely held view.
So people on East Coast time sometimes have trouble doing the calculation to Mountain time.
Imagine New Yorkers thinking that they were the center of the world. This is shocking. Yeah, they're like, and you know what? I've had recently, I do a lot of these pods now in Europe. Where I've got scholars from like England and France and other places of renown, and I'm like doing. We did one in England the other day, but like they didn't. We had scheduled it, but they didn't have the time change.
Oh, that is a tough one.
So she just happened to show up an hour early, and it happened to be on the right time, and it was lovely and great. But the hard part is like I work during the day. And then I have to like try to do these, and you're like, "Oh, we can just do it at night." I was like, "We can." So thank you, because for you guys listening, it's like 8:39. It's bedtime. I'm old. I go to bed in 21 minutes. So so this is good. I'm excited to talk to you about.
Yeah, it's after the kids go to bed. So
you know what? Yeah, exactly. Well, right before you jumped on, I'm like just begging the dog. I'm like, "Can you just sit there for an hour?" Maybe.
Yeah,
we'll see. So. Tell you what, before we jump in, do you want to introduce yourself and like what you do?
Sure, yeah. I'm Scott Spillman, originally from Atlanta, Georgia. That's where I grew up, and then went to college at the University of North Carolina, studied English, history, political philosophy there, really loved Chapel Hill, and then went off to graduate school in history at Stanford. Stayed out there a few years doing my coursework and teaching and stuff. And then my wife got a job in Colorado. And so we've been in Colorado for 13 and a half, 14 years now. While I was working on my dissertation, kind of splitting my time between various public history projects and working on the dissertation that became this book, Making Sense of Slavery.
The bad part is that, you're from Georgia, but because you got this Stanford thing now, you're like one of the people from California out here in Colorado. Do you just find yourself, like telling people when they ask you where you're from, do you just say Georgia and omit the California thing?
Oh, yeah. I rarely mention the California part of my life experience. I feel like I sort of, put that down low and emphasize the Georgia, the North Carolina, and the Colorado.
I've got flavor right from the South. I'm here to like bring food. I moved out here and they were like, just don't say you're from Texas or California. You're okay.
Oh yeah, that's like, definitely a thing.
I'm like, okay, well, I'm from Florida and Kentucky and the rest of the South. So let's go. All right, you're here. You wrote a book, a large, beautiful book. The one I'm holding right here, Making Sense of Slavery, America's Long Reckoning from the founding era to today. This book is really freaking cool, dude. I really dug this book.
I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah, man. And it wasn't what I was expecting, frankly. Whenever I received the book, when I was talking to Basic, and they just sent me all the stuff, right? I was like, all right, cool. Well, it's a book on slavery, but it's not a book on, not at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the first line of the book.
Yeah, I was like, when I picked it, I was like, oh, I'll be damned. So this is a different book entirely. This is about a book about the way people thought about slavery, right?
Yeah. So I think of it as an intellectual history of how Americans have studied slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it focuses primarily on scholars, on historians, sociologists, other kinds of social scientists, but also it crosses over into political arguments and popular culture when I see those as relevant to the story. And so essentially the main question I wanted to answer was, what have Americans known about slavery, and sort of when and how have they known it? Have they found it out? And so I read a bunch of old books and articles about slavery, looked at the letters and drafts of people who wrote them to see what they were thinking. And what I found essentially is that Americans have been studying and arguing about slavery for a really long time, basically for as long as the United States has been around, because the same Enlightenment moment that gave rise to the revolution also made slavery into a problem and gave people the intellectual tools to study that problem in something like a way that we still recognize today.
Yeah, it's been called America's Great Sin, right? That and alongside indigenous displacement and genocide. And reading through the book, I couldn't help but think, and we'll come back to this a little bit later on about the contemporary debates over history, over slavery, over the things that don't make us feel good when we read about them. And I couldn't find, as I read your book, I was like, wow, this is so relevant to today, because people are also having these debates over slavery internally. Even historians, like some of these historians don't come out all that great. I was like, you're a bad guy. So yeah, I want to jump you. I want to jump into this and ask you, so you kind of jumped in here a little bit earlier, talk about really the study of slavery in the Americas really kind of happens before there's a quote unquote United States, right? And you point to some very specific moments and some very specific people. They're like, okay, let's talk about this, right? So you want to talk a little bit about how that comes to be?
Sure. Yeah, I did really try to make there be kind of a specific place and even a specific person who I identify as the first kind of scholar of slavery in the United States. And the person I pick out is a guy named Anthony Benezet, whose family was originally from France. They fled France because they were Protestants who were being persecuted, eventually landed in Philadelphia in the 1730s, and Benezet became a Quaker. And so he was influenced by those, Quaker ideas, egalitarianism, inner light, that start to turn Quakers against slavery in the middle of the 18th century, sort of in the 1740s, 50s, 60s period. Benezet is also influenced by Enlightenment philosophy that's taking shape. People like Montesquieu, the philosophers of the Scottish Enlightenment, these new ideas of natural rights, egalitarianism. And so those two pieces, the Quaker religion and the Enlightenment philosophy, are sort of giving him the intellectual framework to become anti-slavery. And that happens sort of in the 1740s, 1750s. He even starts teaching Black kids and adults in Philadelphia at his house in the evenings. He's a school teacher, and so he sort of takes that on as an extra thing, and is able to see, like, oh, these Black people, these African Americans they have the same capacities intellectually, emotionally, and so on. Then the key piece that he adds that I think makes him distinctive is that he learns from sort of some of this Enlightenment philosophy, these Enlightenment studies of society that are starting to take place, that he can provide empirical evidence to kind of back up his arguments. And so he turns to different sources to try to get information about Africans and about slavery. And that one cool thing that he does is he takes these sources that are actually kind of pro-slavery sources, travel writings about Africa from people who aren't necessarily friendly to Africans, journals from people who have been on slave trade voyages, things like that. And he does what we would call reading them against the grain. And so he goes through them and he sees, like, oh, even though you say these negative things about Africans, the descriptions that you have actually show that they have fairly well developed economies, fairly complex governmental and social systems, that they're not savages, but actually have, this kind of sophisticated culture. And so he extracts these quotations and facts and sort of builds them into these pamphlets that he starts to write. The first one comes out in 1759, I want to say, and then he publishes a series of them over the 1760s and early 1770s. And he's got sort of the religious and moral arguments against slavery, but he's adding in this layer of empirical evidence to make his case and to try to convince people using evidence and show them why he thinks what he does and try to convince them to come over to his cause. And he ends up being actually remarkably successful in that. He ends up having this big network. This is the era of kind of the Republic of Letters. And so he's connected to people in Britain and in France because he can speak multiple languages, having come originally from France. And so he's kind of a catalyst for the whole Atlantic abolitionist movement, and helps it get started in Britain, where some of the really early British anti-slavery folks read Benezet's pamphlets and get inspired. He's in correspondence with similar abolition societies in France. And so I see him as a pretty key figure, both in the rise of the abolition movement and in the rise of the study of slavery, that those two are kind of intertwined at the start.
Benezet is, prior to me, like, reading your book, I wasn't familiar with him. Were people that, like, maybe our listeners were listening to, like, are familiar with, were they reading him as well? Guys like Franklin or like who was reading him amongst, say, the founding generation?
Yeah, he was friendly with Ben Franklin. They were both in Philadelphia at the same time. They wrote letters back and forth and knew each other, at least some. Let's see, I'm not sure what other founding figures he was connected to. Some other people in his circle then end up being connected to folks like Jefferson and Madison and so on, then in this like later 1770s and 1780s. Unfortunately, Benezet ended up passing away in, I want to say, 1784 or so. And so, he doesn't then get to see through kind of the rise of the United States post-revolution. But he is like very involved in the Philadelphia of the 1760s and 70s. And so, most people who were active in Philadelphia at that moment knew of him. I believe he even sent one of his pamphlets to the Queen of England. And, he's in conversation with various imperial agencies and stuff. He's the kind of reformer who has a lot of zeal, and it's constantly just, like trying to get the word out there. Yeah. Yeah. Trying to get the word out there, trying to connect to people. And so he's a fascinating figure, and a really important one who could stand to be better known.
Yeah. It's really too bad about that he doesn't survive, much past the revolution, because as I was reading the book, there's so much of this. I almost felt like at times I should just call this book Cognitive Dissonance, a case study on slavery, right? Yeah. Because like you were just saying, people making these remarks, how we are, people, he's reading against the grain, and like, oh wait, there's they're clearly describing a humanity here and whatnot. And then you kind of talk about this like after the war, and memory and identity are so closely linked here. You talk about this, about how slaveholders and elites are really starting to reframe how they view themselves as like these really benevolent slaveholders, that slavery is this good institution. Can you talk about how people are writing about themselves and about what's going on here as people are starting to conceptualize this horrible institution of slavery?
Yeah. One way to think about it is that one really important thing that the revolution accomplished, in the late 18th century, is that it essentially flattens the social structure of what had been the colonies and were now the United States. So that what had been a hierarchical empire with a bunch of different statuses and whatnot now became an egalitarian republic where everyone's a citizen. But then that creates the question of what qualifies somebody for this egalitarian citizenship, political participation. And so then that calls forth new justifications for excluding different types of people who could be framed as dependent or irrational, like children. I feel like I can say that I have 2 7-year-olds who are sometimes a little irrational.
I have a 17-year-old. Believe me, or you haven't seen Irrational yet.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Oh, I can. Oh, that'll be something to have.
Oh, it's fun. It's coming.
Teenagers. Yeah. But anyway, so whites begin to develop an increasingly paternalistic vision of slavery, where they're seeing black slaves as similar to children, and then are able to cast themselves as the protectors and educators of their slaves. But in contrast to actual children who we hope grow up and for the most part become rational and independent human beings and citizens, black slaves were subject to these increasingly rigid ideas of inherent racial difference that cast them as perpetual children who could not sort of grow up and become rational, independent citizens. So they would always require the support of their white owners. And so this is sometimes called the domestication of slavery, because it kind of brings slaves, at least in theory, kind of into the family circle as these perpetual children. And it does have the effect of ameliorating slavery to some extent. It fosters the formation of slave families, although that's also a pretty self-interested policy, especially after the end of the African slave trade in 1808. It also encourages Christianity among slaves. But you do have to question to what extent this was reality and to what extent it was just rhetoric, that white slaveholders were using to justify slavery in the wake of the challenge posed by the revolution to the institution. And so in any case, no matter how you land on the sort of rhetoric reality question, it was a way of meeting the challenge to slavery that was posed by the revolution, and it helped set the terms of the debate over slavery for at least the next few decades, if not longer.
Scott, I wonder, for listeners who might not be as familiar with the institution or the history of slavery, did the moment, there was a time in North America in which a woman might be enslaved, but her children who were born to her were not considered enslaved. And eventually the status of enslavement passes from mother to child immediately upon birth. And I'm wondering, does that happen before this time, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's pretty early. I believe that there are laws in Virginia that start to do that in the 1660s. And so that's part of, there's this early moment, a lot of people know the date 1619 from the 1619 Project, where, this early group of Africans are brought to Virginia. But then there's a period of time, several decades, when there aren't that many slaves in the mainland colonies, when slavery is still kind of taking shape in the the colonies. And then by about the 1660s and 1670s is when you see, certainly in the Chesapeake and in the Carolinas, so like around Charleston, it starts to take off. And scholars today would call that sort of a transition from a society with slaves to a slave society, where from slavery being kind of marginal to the social and economic and political structure of the place to being kind of the foundation of it. And so as part of that, one of the rules, one of the laws that kind of implements that shift is that law that the condition of slavery follows the mother. That then kind of hardens that sort of that you're born into it, that it's perpetual, that it is, this racial descent kind of institution, and that all those are part of this hardening and sort of development, articulation of slavery as this really important piece of these societies as they're taking shape.
Later, we're going to come back to this a little while because I want to talk about, Annette Gordon Reed's work a little bit later on amongst these modern scholars and things like that. But, when we talk about how people are writing and conceptualizing about enslaved Africans as somehow infantile, right, or childlike, this is not stopping the process of rape. Like this is full on and physical. They may intellectually say that Africans are intellectually weak or need to be educated or whatever, but still very much treating, Africans as full adults or even, children. Correct? I mean, the brutality of slavery is still continuing, no matter how people are justifying it, right?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I hope that wasn't unclear in my earlier answer, but yeah. And that's what I meant in terms of kind of the rhetoric versus reality. People are conceiving of or talking about slaves as kind of members of their family, but they are sending them out into the fields. They're beating them. They're raping them. They're selling them, and so on. And so, to some extent, that the language of being part of the family is helping to cover and do some psychological and emotional work, I think, in terms of justifying it both out in society and in one's own mind.
I was in New Mexico just recently, down at Fort Union. I don't know if you know where this is. It's near Las Vegas, New Mexico. I was going down to see where they filmed Red Dawn, actually, and I went down to Fort Union, which is like the Civil War outpost, right? And I couldn't help but think about some of the works by people like Ari Kelman or Megan Kate Nelson, or even say Matt Karp, his book, This Vast Southern Empire. And I think it kind of really, what Karp talks about is how these southern elites really envision this very, very hemispheric empire for slavery, based upon slavery. And I think there's a tie in here to what you're talking about here too, which is like how historians are viewing the linkages between slavery, the institution of slavery, the practice of slavery, and also national expansion. How are historians looking about this at this point in time? Are they turning a blind eye? Because we're going to get to George Bancroft here in a second. Like, what's going on here?
Yeah, I would say there are complex connections between slavery.
Historians are complex?
Yeah, between slavery and national expansion, and kind of more broadly between slavery, land, and labor. Is sort of how I talk about it in the book. People have seen a connection between slavery and free land at least since the middle of the 18th century. Ben Franklin actually has a little essay that he wrote called Observations on the Increase of the Population, something like that, in the early 1750s, where he observed that when there's plenty of available free land, it's very hard to keep hired help because the workers are always leaving to set up their own farm or their own shop or whatever. And so in those conditions where you can't keep hired help, you can't pay people enough wages to stay in working for you, because they're always leaving for a better opportunity. The idea then is that slavery naturally arises as a solution to the problem of how to build up larger enterprises that require more work than just what's available in your own household, your own family. And so free labor free land, kind of causes slavery in that way. And one kind of additional corollary to that idea is that if the land gets crowded with enough people, if there's no free land anymore, then slavery naturally will eventually drop away, because then the workers will not have the option of moving away to free land. And they'll eventually have to settle for working for wages. And in fact, eventually, if you read someone like Thomas Malthus, for wages so low that they undercut slavery and lead to starvation and all that kind of stuff.
Wow, it's like the trickle-down theory of its time.
Yeah. And so these are kind of complicated and overlapping arguments, but the upshot is that there were incredible debates about all this stuff in the early 19th century, as the United States was simultaneously developing some early industry and wage labor, at the same time that it was also vastly expanding its territory, kind of between the period of the Louisiana Purchase and then the Mexican War, in that period when it goes from being kind of up to the Mississippi to being like all the way across the continent. And then, at the same time as that, all that's happening, the slave South and the free North are then increasingly coming into conflict over, which form of society and economy were going to take precedence in these new territories that are being acquired. And so some Americans at the time see expansion as necessary to provide the land needed to maintain an independent landowning citizenry. This is sort of the free labor folks who end up becoming part of the Republican Party. Others see expansion as necessary to support slavery. You need to keep expanding to have land for slavery to move into, or just to make it kind of economically and socially feasible. And at the same time, both of those sides are fearing, for different reasons, that a lack of new land for expansion could potentially threaten their whole social and economic and political order, either leading eventually to emancipation and sort of a concentration of free Black people in the South, or leading to this sort of Malthusian nightmare of like starvation and dependent wage workers in the North. And so all of that is happening in this sort of like 18 teens to 1840s, 50s period. And there are all kinds of debates. People are invoking Thomas Malthus on the floor of the House of Representatives in debates over the Missouri Compromise, for example. George Bancroft, if you want to get to him, was reaching back to Roman history to think about the relationship between slavery and free peasantry back in the 1st and 2nd century BC, and it's this kind of incredible intellectual stew and debate that also has this really high relevance to what's going on in the country at the time. These key questions about slavery and expansion and citizenship in the country.
I can't help as you're talking to me about this to like compare this to almost some kind of like Darwinian natural order of things, applied in an economic sense that in turn alleviates the guilt of slavery. It's like, oh, well, it's going to die off once things kind of take care of itself. We don't have to, it's bad, but like it'll be fine. I mean, it's
yeah, I mean, I don't think you're totally wrong on that. You see people as early as maybe the 18 teens, possibly earlier in the 1790s, starting to make calculations of, okay, when will the population density be such that slavery will naturally wither away? and it's decades, if not centuries, in the future in their minds. But they're kind of making those calculations and trying to figure it out. And then later, after the Civil War, you still have people making similar arguments who are kind of trying to defend the South or defend slavery, saying, the Civil War wasn't really necessary because slavery would have naturally died away anyway. Like if we had just given it some time, it would have died away for X, Y, or Z cause. And so that is kind of a through line of people trying to kind of turn away from the need to have a political confrontation over slavery, I would suppose.
Yeah, and I'm kind of wondering, there's another question here that I'm thinking about here, which is more of a societal understanding of society itself, which is, are historians actively shaping thought at this time? Is the American populace literate? Are they going to history books and reading this and actively thinking about this? I mean, what did your research tell you as far as the influence of people like Bancroft on the populace?
Yeah, Bancroft is probably one of the best examples because he was probably the most prominent historian in the U.S. during these years. He published the first volume of the book for which he's best known, his mammoth History of the United States, in 1834. It eventually grew to 10 volumes over the next 40 years. And at the same time, he was also a free labor Democrat, a member of the Jacksonian Democratic Party, who believed pretty strongly in the necessity of expansion to secure an American future that would be egalitarian and democratic and full of economic opportunity. And he's a case you don't see them that often because historians are not always kind of like wielding the levers of power. But he, in his case, became Secretary of the Navy during the Polk administration in the 1840s. And in that position actually helped the United States gain a huge amount of new territory in the Mexican War. And so, even though Bancroft continued to see expansion in his mind as a way to soothe sectional tensions and secure the country's future, he was also helping to acquire all this land that was south of the Missouri Compromise line, and so was open to slavery. And how he reconciled that is kind of an open question, I would say. In the book, I'm able to use the wonderful device of that he secures for himself a diplomatic post in Europe, and so basically leaves the country and doesn't have to deal with that question.
Convenient for him. I kept thinking as I was reading through this, because of course the origins of all the things that I do now are through film. I don't want to film on Bancroft. No one's going to watch that. But if I can see Bancroft just kind of show up in like a period, and I can just I don't know, I can heckle him. I don't know. That was a bit of my thoughts. We would never hear Bancroft's name ever again. I want to ask you about Dred Scott and Roger Taney.
Sure.
And talk about the years kind of leading up to the war. You can't talk about slavery without talking about Dred Scott, without talking about Taney. What's Taney's thoughts on slavery, and how is it being affected by the histories of the area of the era?
Sure. Yeah. So by the time we get to the 1850s, there's starting to be these competing ideas about slavery, and they're getting increasingly rigid and hard, and are also developing kind of ideas about the kind of society that slavery and freedom form around them as well. Sort of competing almost sociological theories that are depending on both sociology and law to think about how slavery shapes a society. And so he and the Dred Scott decision are kind of part of that as it's taking shape in the 1850s. At the same time as another thing that's becoming more rigid in that time period is ideas about race. You get these really we would call them wild, conceptions of race and the history of race, saying that essentially, Black people are not are a separate creation from whites. This is polygenesis.
Mm-hmm.
They've been slaves from basically the beginning of time. You can see them as far back as Egypt, depicted as slaves in different, drawings and pyramids and whatnot. And so Tawny is engaged with and sort of acting in the midst of those debates about sociology and law and race. And so one of the big questions that he's known for in Dred Scott decision is the question of Black citizenship, where he essentially says, Black people have never been citizens and essentially can never be citizens in the United States, which is kind of drawing on some of these ideas about race and the idea that Black people have always been in this slave status. And then in the legal realm, Dred Scott is all about this question of whether or not slavery can cross over different jurisdictions. Like, what is the status of slavery across state lines? And he's saying that essentially, slavery can go anywhere, that there's this right to property, right to hold slaves, that continues. And so that becomes, that had already been a major question certainly since the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. But even going back farther, several decades before, there had been a series of Supreme Court cases about questions of, whether slave status continued if, an owner took a slave to a free state and then back, if an owner settled in a free state, if a slave, was able to escape to freedom, and so on. And so these are all big questions about the status of slavery that then become even bigger as a result of the Dred Scott case, which sort of raises them to a new prominence, and then become key questions then as we move into the Civil War, where then the questions of slavery across state lines now become kind of questions of slavery almost across sort of international lines in a state of war. And so there are all these different scholars and legal thinkers trying to wrestle with this question of what is the status of slavery in a state of war? What is the status of slavery in the state of nature? How does it continue? How do we think about these questions? And so Tawny is kind of right at the heart of that as, the country is moving toward a giant conflict over all those issues.
One of the things that I found annoying about your book was just how relevant it is. And I'm going to point to a thing right now. We hear a lot right now about the 14th Amendment, Scott, about birthright citizenship. The president has said, I want to get rid of birthright citizenship. For people who are listening in right now, can we talk about what the 14th Amendment? I've always thought of this amendment as maybe the single most important amendment in the Constitution. But can you talk a little bit about what the 14th Amendment is and what birthright citizenship is and how it's linked to slavery and the ideas behind it?
Sure. So the 14th Amendment came about in the years after the Civil War, and essentially what it does is it takes the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and writes it directly into the Constitution. It's a little more complicated than that, but that was the basic goal. And one goal of that Civil Rights Act and of the 14th Amendment is essentially to secure citizenship for former slaves and their descendants in the wake of emancipation. And so the birthright citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment, it basically it kind of defines national citizenship. But it takes citizenship away from any tie to race or national origins or legal status of parents or anything like that, and just makes it something that's available equally to all people born in this place, whether your parents were slaves or immigrants or whatever. And so that was able to settle the question of Black citizenship, and at least laid the foundations, even though it didn't happen for quite some time in practice, for former slaves and the children of slaves to become equal participants in the political life of the country.
I want to ask you a little bit about life after the war, because we kind of move into the post-war years, the Jim Crow era, things like that. Shay Cox has written a lot about this, about how material culture affects memory and nostalgia and national identity. But I'm kind of wondering if we can talk about, how conceptions of slavery, alongside things like 14th Amendment, but moving past that, what are the stories Americans start to tell themselves about slavery after this bloody, horrible war is over?
Yeah, one thing that's striking is that the people who lived through it continue to argue over the war and the role of slavery in causing the war for basically about a generation, until maybe the early 1880s or so. And one thing that develops during that period of argumentation is the idea of the lost cause, a phrase that first comes to real prominence in the work of a Southern writer named Edward Pollard. And the idea is basically that the cause of the South, the reason that it was fighting, wasn't slavery, but was actually something else, they say. And this is variously defined as white supremacy or constitutional liberty. And the idea is basically, at its most cynical, the idea is basically that the North had just used slavery as a tool to try to foist Northern domination or governmental centralization or tyranny or whatever sort of thing you choose onto the South. And one major appeal of this idea, is that it turns the cause of the South away from slavery, which is dead and gone for good, and recasts the cause of the South as this good fight that can still be seen as active and even able to be won during and after Reconstruction. You can still fight for white government, or you can still fight for constitutional liberty, depending on how you're framing this lost cause. And so that's how one way that you get figures like Robert E. Lee and symbols like the Confederate battle flag that attain this kind of slippery symbolism over the years, that can be cast kind of opportunistically as either like a principled opposition to despotism or kind of a little guy opposition to government interference, while also still always retaining that important layer of white supremacy and racism kind of baked in there. And then one thing that enables this lost cause view of the South to really take hold is that then by the 1880s and 1890s, a new generation of Americans who grew up after the Civil War is really ready to move on from what they see as these stale old slavery debates. You can imagine like a generation coming of age, like after Vietnam, for example, being tired of hearing their parents talk about Vietnam in the 60s. It's kind of that same sort of dynamic. And so the great historian Frederick Jackson Turner is actually an example of this with his frontier thesis, which is that famous idea that American democracy was essentially forged and continually renewed along the frontier. And, Turner gave this as a speech and published it in 1893. But if you look back at it today and actually read it closely, you see that one really striking aspect of it is that he very deliberately and even pretty forcefully says that historians had been focusing way too much on the slavery debates. And that those slavery debates, in his mind, were actually not so central to American history. that the really important developments in American history in the middle of the 19th century were happening elsewhere. He's a great writer, and so he even has these things where he's like, it's not on a north-south axis, it's actually on an east-west, and so he's used kind of shifting how we think about American history from this north-south conflict to this sort of east-west movement. And then that becomes a keynote for a lot of the kind of capital P progressive historians who followed Turner. People like Charles Beard, for whom the Civil War ends up being about, a transition from an agricultural to an industrial country. And so slavery is just a side issue. But there's this kind of turning away from the debates about slavery, from thinking of slavery as central to national history and national life, and instead focusing on these sort of social economic history that doesn't include slavery, the expansion, the industrialization, and so on.
It's awfully convenient for Turner and Beard and all these guys to be white men saying that slavery isn't really a focal point in the American narrative. How convenient for them that they weren't, that they don't see that. But we're seeing turn of the century, some rise of some really amazing Black scholars writing about slavery reconstruction. We have to talk about Du Bois. Like, what is W.E.B. Du Bois doing here intellectually that changes the game here? Because this guy he's the man. Like, how do we think about Du Bois? And if you haven't read Du Bois, how dare you? Go do that after you listen to the pod.
Yeah, he's extremely impressive and does not disappoint when you dive into his work. And one thing that I really enjoyed about this project and the way that he fits into my stories, I felt like I got to see a side of Du Bois that people might not focus quite as much on these days, which is some of his really early work. He was born in Massachusetts in the late 1860s, came of age, got his PhD, tried to get it in Germany. His funding was kind of withdrawn by a white funding organization. And so he ended up getting his PhD at Harvard in 1895. And his thesis was actually on the slave trade and attempts, or what he saw as sort of weak and half-hearted attempts by the U.S. government to suppress the slave trade after it was formally outlawed in 1808. And so his earliest scholarly work then was about slavery and the slave trade. And then his early positions were actually in the field of sociology. And so he did some studies of different communities and then eventually gets a job at Atlanta University and develops this incredibly ambitious plan to do like a series of studies, one a year for 10 years on different topics like the Black church, the Black family, Black business, and so on. One a year for 10 years, and then repeat that 10 times so that you would have this incredible like longitudinal series of sociological studies of Black life over this huge period of time. But what's really interesting about those is that in those studies, he always has this historical kind of introduction or introductory element where he's showing kind of the historical development of whatever institution it is, whether it's the Black family or the Black church. And in those historical studies, he's doing some of the first and certainly some of the only at that time work on things like slave society, what we would call slave society or slave culture, at a time when slavery was typically viewed either through the lens of these political debates that people were still writing about, or kind of from the side of slave owners thinking about slavery as a business, thinking about its effect on whites and kind of viewing it from that side. And Du Bois is thinking about, okay, how do people live within this institution as slaves? And so that's one of his major contributions in that early moment. And so he's then in conversation with and in debate with some of these prominent white scholars who are either turning away from slavery on the one hand, or if they're still focused on slavery, are increasingly seeing it in the early 20th century as a benign, beneficent institution, to some extent kind of a revival of some of those pro-slavery arguments from the antebellum period, seeing slavery as a school for civilization and so on. And Du Bois is looking at it and saying, no, it's that's not how it's operating. That's not what it is. That there's brutality there. There's also like incredible culture there, and seeing all kinds of different things in slavery that some other scholars are missing.
Is Du Bois having an influence amongst white audiences at the time, or is that a thing that kind of happens later? Like, is he? He's a black man writing about black history in this still incredibly racist world. Not that it's gotten a whole lot better since then, but it's like, where's his influence? Is he making a mark right then and there, or is it taking a while for people to come around to it?
He has some influence.
Okay.
He's, as much as any black scholar had or maybe could have had at that time. He invites various prominent white figures, white scholars and politicians to the conferences at Atlanta University where he presents these Atlanta University studies. People like Jane Addams. I think maybe the president of Harvard went down, Franz Boas, a governor of Georgia or mayor of Atlanta, somebody. Those kinds of figures are attending some of those conferences. He spoke at the American Historical Association conference a couple of times. He published the first and only for many decades article in the American Historical Review that I believe came out in 1910. And so he is able to speak to white scholars from a position of relative equality. But he's doing it from, a black institution that is not as well funded and resourced as white institutions. He's having to fight tooth and nail for all the funding that he gets. And then when he crosses Booker T. Washington in the sort of first decade of the 20th century, so that drops out too. And so eventually by 1910, he decides to kind of leave academia and go into the world of activism. That's when he leaves Atlanta University and takes a job with the NAACP and becomes, their, I think, director of research and editor of The Crisis for the next, couple decades. And so he enters kind of a different phase of life. And so that's kind of one of the stories, is that black scholars are able to kind of enter the conversation, but they remain sort of on the margins, at least for as far as white scholars are concerned, for quite a while there in the early 20th century. You see that with Du Bois. You see that with Carter Woodson as well, who's able to develop, some institutions that have longevity and in fact still exist today. With the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, the Journal of Negro History, but that are not sort of at the center or even like firmly ensconced within sort of white mainstream educational and research institutions. And that only, as I see it anyway, that only really starts to change in the post-World War II period, which is when you get the first tenured Black professors at historically white institutions, with folks like John Hope Franklin in the 1950s, and then more later in the 1960s and 70s, if that makes sense.
One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, and this another thing that's actually quite dear to my heart, Scott, is we see in the 1920s all of these monuments going up. In my hometown of Murray, Kentucky, there is to this day a statue of Robert E. Lee on our courthouse square. I still can't stand looking at it, and I seem to miss it every time I try to run over it in my F-150. But for people listening, can we talk a little bit, because there's another debate, and it seems like this debate just won't die, about the role of monuments and how they're telling that specific history about enslavers like Robert E. Lee and the South and the institution of slavery during the age of Jim Crow, but that continues all the way up into today.
Yeah, and so a lot of those monuments do go up, you're right, kind of at the 50th anniversary of the Civil War emancipation period, which is also like right at the height of Jim Crow rule in the South in the 19-teens and 20s, and are very much a part of this movement to cast the Old South in a positive light, see it in these sort of moonlight and magnolia shades, while also using that history to prop up the Jim Crow regimes. And you see that powerfully with what's now called the Dunning School, after William Dunning, this historian at Columbia University, who wrote about Reconstruction, and who saw Reconstruction as a failure, and basically because he didn't think that Black people could be really equal participants in political democracy. And that idea, it's not unique to him by any means. He was participating in a much broader cultural and social phenomenon at that time. But he and his students and other scholars gave that a scholarly sort of imprimatur that then does continue to help prop up segregation regimes, then all the way until the 50s. And you can see that also with slavery scholarship to some extent, where one of Dunning's students was this guy named Ulrich Phillips, originally from Georgia, who got his PhD under Dunning at Columbia, and then would go on to write what's basically the first really big synthesis on American slavery in 1918, called American Negro Slavery. And he takes the view that slavery was this benign and beneficent institution, a school for civilization. And that was the standard history of slavery from when it was written in the 19-teens all the way up until the early 1950s. It was still being assigned in graduate schools. And so one really interesting thing that I actually didn't get to go into as much in the book as I would have liked is that moment is actually a moment when higher education in America is, expanding at a pretty rapid rate. After the progressive era has kind of expanded high schools across the country, more people are getting into college, and then particularly, during and after World War II. And that's the standard history. Those are the standard accounts at this kind of crucial moment in the development of American higher education. And so then the people who are then going out into the world and who have power by the time you get to the 1950s, 1960s, particularly in the South, have absorbed and been educated in these ideas about slavery and about Reconstruction over the previous generation or two. And that really colors then the way that they think about it and the way that they respond to, movement for Black equality and Black rights and so on after World War II.
I kept thinking as you were saying that Ulrich had some pretty radical ideas for a guy whose name was originally Ulysses. So,
Yeah, but he chose to change it.
yeah, and I see why. So you're like, okay. For those who were listening, just read the book. You'll get my joke in a bit. When we start talking about history, one of the things that through historians of the movies has really informed to me over the 7 years we've been doing this now, Scott, is how much people take in through their understanding of the past through pop culture. And you talk about this in the book as well through things about like Birth of a Nation, Gone with the Wind, Roots. What is pop culture doing throughout the 20th century to inform Americans about the history of slavery, good or bad? It feels like there's a lot of bad here too. Like what's going on when we talk about pop culture? Is it hurting us? Is it hindering? Like what's going on here?
Yeah, that's a good question. What is pop culture doing?
What's pop culture? I don't even know. What is TikTok? I don't. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. But the way I tried to think about it for the book, and one of the reasons that I include some of those books and movies and other things in there is that I see culture as both reflecting and shaping scholarship, just as scholarship is reflecting and shaping culture, and so they're kind of in conversation with each other all the time. And so one example of that is Birth of a Nation, which, as I'm sure you know, is drawing on the work of scholars like Woodrow Wilson, who then is president when it comes out. As well as
fist.
as well as the broader culture at the time, in its negative depiction, sort of infamously negative depiction of Reconstruction and of Black Americans. But then it's also provoking scholars who are opposed to it to do more work to show why they think it's wrong. And so in 1915, when Birth of a Nation came out, you see the sociologist Robert Park at the University of Chicago organizing a conference on Black folklore as a way to demonstrate Black humanity to wide audiences. And then later that year, also in Chicago, and for similar reasons, was when Carter Woodson founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And so even though Birth of a Nation is drawing on the scholarship that casts Reconstruction in a negative light, and then it's continuing to influence people and inform ideas about Reconstruction, it's also at the same time kind of spurring this movement and this scholarly work that would ultimately, undermine that view of Black Americans, undermine that view of Reconstruction. And then to take another example from much later, another thing I talk about is Toni Morrison's Beloved.
Yeah.
A great novel published in the late 80s. And it drew on some of the great slavery scholarship of the 70s and early 80s, including some of the very early work that was done on women and slavery starting in the 1970s. And so it was drawing on the scholarly work. But then since it was published, it's also influenced then a fair amount of slavery scholarship. You can see it. It's actually cited. Taya Miles cites it. Saidiya Hartman thinks with and about Beloved a lot. Christina Sharp, a philosopher and kind of literary scholar, thinks about and with Beloved a ton. And so they've used it to think about topics like women and slavery and the trauma of slavery and various other topics in their own work. And so it's fascinating to me, and I'm not sure I can generalize about sort of the relationship between culture and scholarship, but there are certain cultural productions that either in their engagement with ideas or their effect more broadly in society have this kind of lingering influence, both in public ideas and in scholarly sort of responses on this topic.
So I have a confession to you. I messaged Annette Gordon-Reed last night when I was reading your book. I was like, Annette, you're in this book. She's like, really? I didn't know that. I was like, you are. I was like, it's good. This is my chance to fanboy once more over Annette Gordon-Reed, who I love and adore. I think she's just one of the most amazing human beings. Famously wrote Hemings' of Monticello. There's so much history that's been written, say, in the last, and I hate to say like recently, the last 50 years, going back, and I'm thinking about Genovese and so forth, right? But because I don't want to give away the entirety of your book. But can we talk, Scott? I'm happy to. I'll sit here and talk to you for another 3 hours on this book. Can you talk about like what's the exciting works out there? Why is Annette's work so gosh darn important? Like what's out there, maybe 1619, but like what's going on that's really influencing thought right now when we think about slavery in 2025?
Yeah, that's a good question. I will say
you have 4 hours to respond.
Yeah. For me personally, Hemings' Monticello is the last great book about slavery.
Yeah.
And I mean, because it's one of the great books about American history. It's kind of full stop. It's an incredible book. To some extent, one friend of mine who read my book thought that my little brief section on Annette Gordon Reed was sort of the culmination of the book. And to some extent, I think that is as well. It draws together a bunch of threads, brings some things full circle. And I really enjoyed being able to reread the Hemingses and write that section. But in terms of like contemporary scholars who are doing important work and stuff that's influencing thought today, I mean, one way to answer that question would be to look just kind of at who's winning some of the big awards, who is seen to be influential. And that would be, like Jennifer Morgan just won a MacArthur, last year. Taya Miles also has the MacArthur.
Can I say the problem with Taya Miles? Taya Miles went to Minnesota, and I went to Minnesota. Do you know what it's like having to go to, coming out of the same program to produce Taya Miles?
Yeah.
There's nothing I can do.
You haven't lived up to that?
I've talked to Taya a couple times briefly earlier in my career. I'm in awe.
Oh, yeah, because she's really interested in environmental history and public lands and stuff.
Okay. She's written all this indigenous stuff. She's actually the reason why I went to Minnesota. When I was deciding where to go, because I saw Taya Miles went to Minnesota, I was like, I will go to Minnesota.
Oh wow!
And I became me, and she's her. So whatever. But yeah,
I think she's a really good example of because she does a bunch of different stuff, all of which is basically the subjects that are hottest right now, I would say. Women and slavery, indigenous slavery, environmental history of slavery, material history of slavery, trying to think about and find sources in different kinds of ways. She's doing all of that. A number of other people are doing it too. What's remarkable to me about her is that she's somehow doing all of it in each one of her books.
She's not human, and she pumps out work so gosh darn fast.
Yeah, it's every 2 years.
It's not fair to us mortals.
I'm happy to read it as it comes out. Another thing I've been interested in recently is new scholarship over the past, decade or two about early Black abolitionists and civil rights advocates. Books like Kate. Is her last name Mazur?
Kate Mazur. Yeah.
Until Justice Be Done. There's a new book that came out last. Oh, you got it.
It's on one of my shelves.
Yeah, there's mine.
It's the fun part where two history nerds do start comparing. Go on.
Yeah, we can just point at our bookshelves. That'll be really exciting.
I have Legos. Just go
on. But Sarah Groningseder's book, The Rising Generation, that came out last summer. And then for me, one of the most important and influential recent books has been Dylan Penningroth's Before the Movement. I'm not sure if you've read that or had him on. I think it's fantastic.
Okay.
But it starts in slavery and then goes up until sort of early 20th century, before the civil rights movement, as the title indicates. But it shows how Black people had certain rights and knew how to use the law in specific ways, going all the way back to slavery. So, had kind of customary or everyday rights to property, even if it wasn't codified, but could kind of argue and go to a court of law and be like, well, but this is kind of how it's done here. And that then after emancipation, there are specific ideas about property and about marriage and about associations where, it's not kind of traditional civil rights as we think about it in terms of like voting and so on, but that Black people in the South and in all kinds of places are going to courthouses and are using law and know how to use the law. And it just like does this really interesting thing where it reframes how you think about Black history and to some extent about slavery and about the civil rights movement. And I think it's just a fantastic book.
Have you read Elena Roberts' book, I've Been Here All the While?
No, I haven't.
She writes about Black slavery in Indian country. And it's so very, very good.
That sounds wonderful.
Yeah, it's really good. And then Edifield's Black's new book, Combi, which is like this big.
I see it there on your shelf.
Is it on my shelf back here somewhere?
Yeah, the black one next to American Zion to the right.
Oh, okay, yeah, okay, yeah. I didn't want to talk about Ben Park. Whatever, that guy, he's one of my buddies. Yeah, that is amazing. And that book is winning all kinds of awards right now.
Yeah, I noticed. Yeah, it sounds really good. I haven't had the chance to dip into it yet. But it's on the list.
She came on the pod to talk about the film Harriet, and we talked about her work. Unlike when Annette Gordon-Reed came on and she talked about Die Hard. So, yeah, that was a get.
Die Hard's a great Christmas movie.
Thank you. Scott, I want to ask you like the big question here, the one that we're really wrestling with right now in society, which is this most recent executive order from President Trump, the Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, right? This seems to be clearly pointed at Black slavery, the legacies of slavery, the legacies of enslavers, the war itself, alongside other traditionally marginalized groups such as American Indian history or LGBTQ communities. What are your thoughts on this? Like what's at stake here when we start to, frankly, whitewash these slavery histories?
Yeah, it's a big and important question. I guess I would take a step back and say that I see that and what's going on right now as part of some broader questions that I talk about in the kind of the last couple chapters of the book, which is that I see slavery as becoming kind of central to academic interpretations of American history by like the 1960s, 1970s. Mm-hmm. And then for me, at least, one of the big stories of slavery scholarship and slavery in American intellectual life since then is the questions of, okay, once slavery is seen as central to academic interpretations of American history, on the one hand, how do you get that idea out there to the public? Which is what we've seen, in like the culture wars of the 80s, questions about that, and then in the 2010s, and especially with the 1619 Project, big questions of how do we get that story out there? And then related to that, and to some extent influencing that first question, is the question of, wait, if slavery is central to American history, how does that change? Does it change the story that we tell about American history? And if so, then how do we get that story out there as well? Mm-hmm. And so academics and other scholars have been wrestling with those questions and trying to kind of get them out into the public. And then as they do, there's pushback and there's disagreement. And my general take on that is that that disagreement is good, that people can and should reasonably disagree about these questions, about interpretations of slavery, interpretations of American history, even whether or not slavery is central to American history. It's fine to disagree on all that. But the right way to settle those disagreements is through open debate and not by shutting down discussions. I hope that one thing that my book shows is that the university, for all its limitations and failures over the years, has at least done a decently good job of providing a setting where people can discuss contentious issues in a reasonable way, can debate them, and that is a great thing and should continue.
Yeah. Scott, I have to tell you, we've been talking now for about an hour and 15 minutes, about your book and the ideas, history and slavery and things like that. And all I can think about is all the things we did not talk about that is in your book, because there's so gosh darn much. And we're talking like, well, and I've got all these notes like in front of me where I'm just like, well, we're going to be here till midnight. And so this book is so gosh darn good. I really, really loved reading it. As a my specialty is Indigenous and environmental history. So be able to kind of read, pardon me, to be able to read through American history of what I am not a specialist in, was a real treat for me. I felt like this is such a really cool book that is available to people who are not specialists in slavery, because I'm certainly not. I have tons of questions on it myself. And sitting here and talking to you was just a freaking blast, dude. This was really, really, really cool.
Oh yeah, thanks for having me on. It was so much fun to talk to you, and I'm so glad to hear that you enjoyed the book. That means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely, man. We'll get this pod up here shortly, and within a couple of weeks, because I want people to go read this book. So thanks for coming on, man.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me.
Of course.